Good evening. I'm Paul Fredette.
And I'm Karen Fredette.
Together, Karen and I minister to hermits and to religious solitaries around the world through Ravensbread Ministries. We've been doing this since 1997, right here from our home in the mountains of western North Carolina. Last March, Brother Sean Bradley kindly invited us to contribute to the efforts of the Interfaith Franciscan community by presenting weekly programs here on the Doves for Peace channel. It's been both our privilege and our pleasure over the last 8 months to contribute reflections and prayer time, meditation time with you all. Most recently, we've been telling the story of a very courageous, inspirational, and fascinating woman, one Chiara di Favaroni di Offerduccio, known to us and to history as Clare of Assisi. A woman who was very much ahead of her own time and a woman who's very much a model for ourselves in our day as we try to respond wholeheartedly and authentically to the spiritual promptings which we are experiencing in our own lives. Last week, our presentation ended on the note of by retelling the episode that took place in the city of Assisi in the year 1206, while Francis Bernardoni, known to history as St. Francis of Assisi, who was to become Clare's mentor and soulmate, right following his conversion experience, where he was walking one day by the ruined chapel of San Damiano on the outskirts of Assisi, and went in to pray. And there, before the crucifix, which we'll show you a picture of, he had a very, very intense experience praying before this crucifix in the small ruined chapel. And in that experience, heard the voice of Christ coming from the painting of the crucifixion, the illustration, saying to him, "Francis, go and rebuild my church, which, as you can see, is falling completely into ruin." Since then, of course, this crucifix has become very renowned across the globe. It's recognized worldwide as the crucifix of San Damiano. But at that time, it was just a dusty icon that had been left to rot in this ruined church. Francis took the words that he heard in his vision literally and began actually rebuilding the small chapel. And to do that, he needed materials, and in order to get the materials, he took bolts of cloth from his father's shop. His father was a wealthy cloth merchant in the city of Assisi, took a number of these bolts of cloth with the help of a friend, and went and sold them in the neighboring town of Foligno, and took the money, coming back in order to purchase materials, supplies,
Stones,
mainly stones, for the church. And also, he was at that time also ministering to the lepers and giving alms to the lepers and helping them. So At any rate, when his father found out about this, his father was extremely irate and imprisoned him in the basement of his own home. But then, when he went on a buying trip out of the country, his wife, Francis's mother, um, released him and placed him or sent him to seek the protection of the bishop. At any rate, when we wound up in last week's presentation, we wound up with Francis being called to a public trial.
We need to mention that his father first tried to bring his son before the secular magistrates.
Ah, yes.
And because Francis was already under the protection of the bishop, he said that they had no right to try him.
Mm-hmm.
So then his father went to the bishop,
Mm-hmm.
and the bishop said yes, that he had a right to accuse his son in the ecclesiastical tribunal.
And it was this ecclesiastical tribunal which was public and which was in the square in front of the cathedral. Now remember, Clare's home, the Affriduccio Palazzo, adjoined the Cathedral of San Rufino. And so she could have possibly even looked down on the piazza from a window in her home, or perhaps she was present in the group that was there in the piazza when Francis not only returned the money to his father, but also completely disrobed, took all of his clothing, and gave it to his father, saying, "Until now, I have called my father, I have called Pietro Bernardoni my father. From now on, I say, Our Father who art in heaven." And with that, Francis had absolutely no possessions left, not even the clothing on his back. The bishop took him into his own quarters and provided him with a rough tunic from a farmhand or whatever that he had available, provided him with a leather belt and the footwear of the day. We don't know whether they were actually sandals or whether they were some kind of woven shoe or whatever, and a staff. And Francis left to live on the outskirts of the city, sometimes in caves. He was ministering with the lepers, and he was rebuilding the small chapel of San Damiano. And this all took place in 1206. When he was through rebuilding San Damiano, he went on to another little church called San Pietro, right?
Right. That was another one they had little chapels dotting the
countryside.
The countryside, yes.
Yeah, and it was a very small thing. And then he continued to move on, working with the lepers and ministering to them and rebuilding these little chapels. And he finally moved on to a third one that was called St. Mary of the Angels. And today, of course, St. Mary of the Angels has been placed inside a much, much bigger church. But in those days, it existed on its own, and it wasn't adorned on the exterior the way it is today. I'd like to show you a picture of what it looks like now, just to show you the size of it, how little it really is. And it's inside this much larger basilica, which is
St. Mary of the Angels. Also, I had the privilege of visiting there and going inside the actual portiuncula, a word that means little portion.
Mm-hmm.
This was little portion of Our Lady. It belonged to the Benedictines, the portion of land where the chapel was. And the Benedictines gave them, by this time in number, the brothers were starting to join Francis. And they gave them permission to use this little portion of land and the chapel.
And for all practical purposes, Francis was establishing himself in a sort of a semi-permanent way there. Apparently, initially, he had camped out along this stream called the Rivo Torto, but he had been, unbeknownst to him, or perhaps for whatever reason, he was encroaching on a pig farmer's area for grazing his hogs, and the farmer asked him to move. And so he took up permanent quarters in this little chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, Santa Maria degli Angeli, which they affectionately called the Portiuncula. While he was there, rebuilding and just living there and working with, ministering with the lepers, and more companions were joining him, some of his former friends from Assisi, as well as people from men from surrounding towns. One day, along comes the feast of St. Matthias, which in those days on the calendar was celebrated in February, and Francis and his companions, by then numbered probably over a dozen, heard the gospel for the day proclaimed during the Mass, and the gospel was from St. Matthew, the 10th chapter of St. Matthew, which was the account of Jesus sending out his disciples as missionaries. Karen, could you read that gospel
I'd
for us?
love to. It's fundamental to the life of the Franciscan order to this day. Jesus sent these men on mission as the 12 after giving them the following instructions. Go after the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, make this announcement. The reign of God is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, heal the leprous, expel demons. The gift you have received, give as a gift. Provide yourselves with neither gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts, no traveling bag, no change of tunic, no sandals, no walking staff. The workman, after all, is worth his keep.
Francis was so profoundly moved. One could say that this was just as the experience before the crucifix of San Damiano was kind of the right-hand moment of his conversion, this was the left-hand moment of his conversion. These two moments just forever shaped the life of Francis Bernardoni. At that point, almost immediately, Francis laid aside his shoes and proceeded to go barefoot, put aside his staff, undid the leather belt, and put on a rope, just a knotted rope around his waist, had no cloak, had just one simple tunic that he wore, and it was pretty much fastened or fashioned in a way that when it was spread out, it looked like a cross.
He loved that symbolism.
It was the shape of the cross that he wore on his person. And of course, it was extremely patched and everything else, but it was very rough woven lazzo, as Karen has already explained. Well, Francis really so moved by this also that he now wanted to preach as Jesus has sent the disciples to preach. Of course, you can imagine Francis and his companions are simple laymen at this time, and while he could be greeted, and was in fact greeted enthusiastically and was supported by many people began to really be moved as well by the authenticity of his words, his speaking of penitence and of peace, but he was also generating a lot of controversy, and there were people who were very much against him and who mocked him and who were outraged by him and his companions, these beggars, so to speak, who were presuming. So rather than appear presumptuous, and Francis himself, being a loyal member of the church, wanting to know whether or not he was on the right track, probably sought the counsel. We don't know exactly how this happened, but probably sought the counsel of Bishop Guido in this, And Bishop Guido arranged for him to travel to Rome and to have an audience with the Pope, to seek the Pope's approval. Today, this seems like just a very far-fetched kind of thing, but in those days, you have to understand that the Pope traveled around quite a bit. The church was not the massive organization, centralized bureaucracy that it is today. The Pope was known, was seen. He wasn't that far away. And so it was not a totally unimaginable thing that Francis and his companions would travel there, especially if they were carrying with them a written request from Bishop Guido for an audience with the Pope. Well, this happened in 1209. So this is about a year following this second part of his conversion experience at the Portiuncula. And he does travel to Rome. And while many of the depictions of this are, there are many, not all of them are very easy to see over this kind of media communication. So I did take the liberty of taking a scene from the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, where that depicts, well, somewhat authentically, the sight of Innocent III meeting with Francis and his brothers and giving them verbal approval of his way of life. Karen?
The thing that he approved was the rule that Francis had assembled from a variety of gospel texts. We're quite sure the text from St. Matthew that we just heard was prominent in that text. And there were a few other things that would have governed group living in those days, but it was extremely simple.
And it was at this time too, because the way of life and the rule involved some preaching. Again, we don't know the real details, but we do know that it was around the same time that Francis was given permission, whether by actual ordination as a deacon, which is presumably what happened, or some other kind of indult or some other kind of permission, whether it was through the immediate hands of the Pope himself or later on through Bishop Guido. But Karen, he was given some kind of status. He and his brothers were given some kind, the friars minor, the little brothers were given some kind of authorization to preach. Correct?
Right, and it makes sense. Deacons were permitted to preach in the church, and it was said frequently in the first biographies of St. Francis that he always refused to be a priest. He felt that that was an honor that was way above him. But the possibility of being a deacon, a layman, ordained to preach to the people, it gave him, the authority so that when he was criticized, he could always say that he had church approval for what he was doing. And that was very important to him. In that day and age, there was a lot of other groups, evangelical groups that were formed. There was the Poor Man of Leon, there were the Humiliati, and there were others that were not very loyal to the church and got branded as heretics.
And many self-styled prophets and preachers and whatever who just took it upon themselves to go out, and when they were perceived as inciting either riots or bringing about chaos or confusion, these people were imprisoned, and some of them were put to death. So Francis really wanted to be within good standing within the church, both for himself and his companions. And so this was very important. Where we're going with this, though, and where it really plays kind of a pivotal role, and where we begin to look at the focus that this is going to bring about with Clare, is that by 1210, Francis has been invited to preach in the Cathedral of San Rufino itself. And again, The Cathedral of San Rufino probably saw all of the nobility who were all in that upper part of the city, and the Favaroni family, their home is right adjacent to the cathedral. So undoubtedly, Clare and her family were present, and no doubt she had, whether she had ever actually seen Francis, like at that occasion when he was called before a public tribunal, or had just simply heard about it from her family members, or whether or not she had actually seen him about town, which he had been for the last several years. Here she undoubtedly heard him preach, heard his message, and saw the ardor in his heart for Christ and for the gospel. Uh, Karen, when?
Well, yes. I mean, I think for Clare probably had seen Francis preaching penance so joyfully within the various piazzas of the city.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very small city, and there are several open squares where the markets were held. So she more than likely had become acquainted with his message. But she was coming to a moment of decision in her own life at this point. Here, Paul is showing us the church of San Rufino, and to the left,
Yeah, it would be to the left on your screen. This area right here, Karen?
closer to the cathedral.
Okay, so
See,
right
there's
in,
like that dark doorway there.
yeah.
That would have been, they believe, the doorway at that time to the palazzo of the Favaroni Ferduccio family. So you can see it was very easy for her to attend Mass where Francis was preaching. And it really, she had been waiting to figure out how she was going to live her life. The family was putting more and more pressure
Mm-hmm.
on her to marry. They had already selected someone to be her espoused, and she was putting off the idea of an engagement. And she knew she had to speak to Francis. She had to know more about what it was
Mm-hmm.
that was moving him, because it was kindling a flame within her. She was already likely living as a home penitent, possibly also tending the lepers and other poor people, giving alms where she could, wearing penitential garments under her clothing,
Mm-hmm.
and just keeping out of sight, so that she wasn't being known as available for marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Because many of the young women would sit at the doorways or the windows of their homes and would watch and be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of the ways in a very chaperoned society that the young people
Mm-hmm.
would get to know each other a bit.
Yeah.
And Clare, for the most part, avoided this.
Yes.
And we have
Right.
that on from the account of her very neighbors who spoke about it after her death. So she, at this point, went out, made an appointment with Francis to meet with him. Quite easily, it could have been done through her cousin, Rufino, who had joined Francis and his brothers, and would have been easy for Clare to speak to Rufino. That wouldn't have raised a lot of questions.
Was there so within the family, the young men and the women who were cousins, and there was an easy interchange at that.
Well,
at that
I think
time?
so. There was the Ferduccio country house where all of the cousins, the sons and daughters of her father's brothers, they would have lived together like brother and sister. So she got in touch with Rufino, and Rufino arranged that Francis would be at a place where Clare could also be without arousing too much attention. She was chaperoned by Bona Guafuccio, was a woman who lived across the piazza from her
Mm.
family, and Frances would have been accompanied by, most often, Brother Philip, so that they were very proper, but they were also very, very careful not to arouse gossip, not to arouse questions among the city, because this would have put an end to everything they were working for. So over a period of a year and a half, this was not a quick thing. She met with him, and he would meet with her. There was a period during Lent of the year 1212 where Francis was preaching by invitation of the bishop. He was giving the Lenten series of talks in the church of San Rufino. And Clare would have met him there, possibly after the talk or before. She could have slipped back into the sacristy area. But always they were very careful not that they never aroused discussion.
Any kind of suspicion or discussion.
No.
But this would have been a very pivotal time that kind of prepares us for the major moment that we want to talk about this evening.
Yes. Clare realizes this is what she is called to do. Francis, they debated and debated how a woman could join the brothers and live on the roads. No, that wasn't possible. Finally, Clare became aware, I think, of Francis spending many weeks at different periods of the year living as a hermit, living in reclusion, and saw that she could live that portion of his calling. Now,
right. And I would imagine that in a time like this and in a situation like this, Francis could not have presumed to welcome a woman into, with whatever safeguards could have been put in place, into that brotherhood or that companionship without consulting with the bishop. And although we have no exact information on what transpired, we have a few legends and a few snippets of hagiography that point us in this direction. But it seems pretty certain that he met with Bishop Guido and informed Bishop Guido who this person was. And Bishop Guido probably figured that if anybody of all the young ladies in the city who could pull this off with any kind of authenticity and could pull it off successfully, it would be Clare Favaroni. So at some point, we believe that Bishop Guido gave Francis permission to receive Clare's vows and to cut her hair in the presence of a priest and within the confines of a church, that this had to be done in a church, in the presence of a priest, and Francis could receive her vows as her mentor, as her guide, as her leader. And then probably it was also arranged where Clare could be suitably housed, even on a temporary basis, before a more permanent arrangement could be made for her living arrangements.
They, I think they were taken up with symbolism, which was very prominent in the Middle Ages, and Francis told Clare, and I think this came from Francis, that she was to go with her family that Palm Sunday and to dress in her finest, almost bridal finery. And this, you hear the draper's son, the cloth merchant, telling Clare to dress as beautifully as she could, go with her family to Palm Sunday Mass in the Cathedral of San Rufino. In those days, the men were on one side of the nave, and the women were all together on the other side. At the beginning of the Palm Sunday service, the bishop was sitting on his cathedral throne. At the front of the sanctuary, and the men and then the women would come up and receive a palm branch from him. And apparently Clare was feeling a lot of tumultuous events. She knows she was at Mass with her family for the last time in her life. And for some reason, perhaps just because she was so nervous, overwhelmed, she did not go up with the rest of the women. And Bishop Guido saw her back there in the nave. He took a palm branch down to her and gave it to her. And some people look at that as his special blessing on what he knew was to come.
Mm-hmm.
And
and the clock was ticking.
The clock was ticking. Clare went back to her home with her family, trying to act like nothing was afoot.
Mm-hmm.
Her sister Agnes probably knew what was about to happen, and also her good friend and kinswoman Pacifica Guelfuccio. Bona, who had always been with her to see Francis, had gone to Rome for Lent. So Pacifica was drawn in to this grand plot.
This plot.
After the family had gone to bed, the doors were closed and locked. Clare had to leave her family home. All homes in Assisi at that time had two front doors. One was your wide, low door through which people came and went and brought everything in and out. There was also another door, smaller, narrow, and about 2 feet above the ground. And this was known as the doorway of the dead, because it was through that doorway that the bodies of people who died within the family home would be carried out.
Mm-hmm.
And the saying was that those who left by that doorway never returned. So that doorway was heavily blocked up, according to what we read in the first biographies of Clare. She had to move some heavy furniture, a broken pillar, maybe even pull aside a drape to get to this doorway, which she could open. She managed to do this quietly and jumped down and was met by Pacifica, who was waiting for her in the street, having left her home across the way. Mm-hmm. And the two of them, I've seen the cobblestone streets that they had to have gone down, mm-hmm. which would have taken them most directly to the roadway that led down to St. Mary of the Angels. They came to the gate of the city, which would have been locked, and somehow they had made arrangements with whoever was on the gate at that time, probably bribery, to unlock the gate for them. Mm-hmm. And they went out. The valley was pretty much forested at that period. Francis was waiting for her in among the trees with a torch.
What would be about the distance between the city walls when you emerge from the city itself and go out to St. Mary of the Angels? About how big a walk, how long a walk would it have been?
I've made that walk, and it's about an hour. And so Francis and a number of his friars met Clare in Pacifica and walked with them down to St. Mary of the Angels, that tiny little chapel that we've already looked at. I've been inside of it. You could get maybe 12 people at most on kneelers. You could crowd in maybe 20 or 25 people.
Yeah, actually, the photograph we're showing you right now is a little bit deceptive because it actually makes it look bigger than it really is. Like Karen says, you can't get much more than 12 to 15 people in there, and that's tight. So,
but
this is as it looks. This is a photograph of the interior of that little chapel that we had shown earlier which is inside, which the entire chapel is now inside the big basilica. But this is the interior of that little chapel as it looks today.
We can imagine that there was probably the book of the Gospels, or maybe the entire Bible, on an altar there. One of the brothers who was a priest, either Brother Leo or Brother Sylvester, was there. Clare walks up to the altar where Francis picks up the scissors that he has and cuts her hair. This very dramatic and wonderful moment, which is pictured, and you can imagine it, because cutting your hair in those days marked you as a, ruined goods. And she was willing.
She was not marriageable at that point.
It would seem very few men would be willing to marry a woman whose hair had been cut, because it indicated she was no longer a virgin. In this case, it also could indicate she was consecrated to God.
We have another illustration here that's a rather ancient one, and rather, Karen, you told me this one's rather famous.
Yes, you can find pictures of this one almost anywhere.
And this actually shows, you can actually see Francis, the figure of Francis standing behind Clare and actually cutting her hair in the presence of these assembled friars over here to the upper right.
Clare would have brought a habit with her, made out of the same material that the brothers were wearing, and Pacifica would have helped her put it on, probably dropped it over her head while she removed the fine clothing that she had worn at Francis' request. We do have a picture of Clare's habit. I think Paul's about to show it to you.
And this is actually a habit of Clare's. It may not have been the one she wore that night, but this is actually a habit, a tunic and a mantle. And you might be able to notice, you might be able to pick it up on your screen, that in the lower left-hand corner is the cord that went about her waist.
So, with her hair shorn, dressed as one of the brothers, Francis asked Clare, "What do you want? What are you seeking?" And these are the words that are preserved for us. Clare's vow was, "I want only Jesus Christ, and to live by the gospel, owning nothing, and in chastity." Implicit in this are the three vows that are often spoken of. There is the vow of chastity, there is the vow of obedience to Francis' gospel life, and the vow of poverty, owning nothing. This is a relatively new way of life for women, because most convents owned property in order to have income to feed themselves. And Clare was saying no, she was going to live the total poverty that Francis made so significant for her brothers, for his brothers.
Well, at this point, Pacifica, in all likelihood, probably didn't realize that now came the hard part for her, because she has the hour walk back home with Clare's clothing and the locks, the shorn locks of Clare's hair, and somehow she has to face the Offerduccio clan. So at that point, it was probably took all the courage she had and all the trepidation that she could imagine as she walked back along that dark path as dawn was coming up, to have to face the ire of Clare's family, especially her father and his brothers, who desperately wanted Clare well married so that their political and economic and military alliances could have been strengthened. While Pacifica is walking back to Assisi, Francis and presumably a couple of other brothers, probably Brother Philip, maybe Father Sylvester, Brother Leo, who knows, went in the other direction for an hour's walk to the Benedictine monastery of San Paolo in Bastia, a small area location about an hour in the other direction from St. Mary of the Angels. And there they had made prior arrangements with the abbess of the monastery for temporary refuge for Clare. And they probably picked San Paolo deliberately because, Karen, it enjoyed a particular status, didn't it?
Yes, that particular monastery had a papal enjoyed special papal protection, which imposed heavy sanctions on anyone who would disturb the peace of the nuns. And probably Guido is the one that approached Mother Abbess and asked that she give Clare shelter temporarily.
Temporarily until a more permanent arrangement. So it's quite an exciting night, full of drama
and symbolism.
And very powerful in the forging of a way of life that both Francis and Clare at this point kind of as Karen has said in her publication, one the torch, the other the flame, and it is the beginning of a very, very high adventure for both of them. And it's an extraordinary moment of self-giving on Clare's part. And what we wanted to do was to conclude this evening, this particular episode, with a wonderful song that kind of embodies the event, the totality of Clare's gift, right?
Yes. This song was again. It was written by a poor Clare nun, Sister Briege O'Hare in Ireland, and the text is taken from Clare's own writings. It's taken from a letter that she wrote to a young woman in Prague, who named Agnes also, who was on the verge. She had been asked to marry the emperor, and she was turning him down. She wanted to become a nun. She had met the friars. She wanted to live as Clare did, and probably had written a letter to Clare saying, "Tell me what you're doing. Describe your life for me and what moved you." And Clare wrote this beautiful, beautiful letter back to Agnes, which has been preserved intact for us. And Sister Briege O'Hare has set it to music. And we have put the text we'll put it on the screen for you so that you can follow it more easily.
Okay, let's try this over here.
I pray on my knees with thanks to Jesus Christ my Lord, for you have surrendered your heart to one who's most adored. You have chosen life. You have chosen love. Chosen to be poor, yet rich in what comes from above. chosen to walk the path which Jesus walked for you. So live by your trust in Him, and know His way is true. Jesus is your life. Jesus is your way. Jesus is your source, who loves you through each day. A wonderful exchange to leave the things of time for those of endless life and blessed joy sublime. So praise Him for your life, as I praise Him for mine. And so our hearts will be one until the end of time. So praise Him for your life, as I praise Him for mine. And so our hearts will be one until the end of time.
We have this most beautiful expression of Clare's own heart, written, I think, as she remembered her introduction to the life that she lived so happily and so faithfully for 42 years.
We want to thank you for joining with us this evening. And before we pray for the blessing of St. Clare as a closing prayer for us, just want to remind you that as we tell the story of Clare, we're following the material that Karen published in her book, Clare, Her Light and Her Song, which, if you're interested, you might purchase yourself. You can obtain by going to our website, ravensbreadministries.com. We'll be happy to send you an autographed copy of her work. And it's the results of this research into the life and times of Clare that we're using to retell the story of Clare. And now we want to take this opportunity to wish you God's blessing in Clare's own words. May the Lord bless you and keep you.
May He show His face to you and be merciful to you.
May the Lord turn His countenance to you and give you peace.
May the Lord be with you always.
And wherever you are, may you be with Him always, too. Good night, and thank you very much for joining with us this evening. We'll see you next week.